Here I am in Adobe Bridge, so I can show you some example images for this assignment. So this group of images here is the same one that I included on the assignment handout as an example of what the same scene would look like at different white balance settings. So you would take the shot on the auto white balance setting, and if you look over here in my metadata, you see on this particular camera model, AWB, so that stands for auto white balance. If we move over to the next one, on this particular camera model, it actually shows us an icon for the sun white balance setting, and the file names actually show us what type of scene we're working with and what kind of white balance setting we're using. Then we're changing it over to the cloudy white balance setting, the tungsten white balance setting, and the fluorescent white balance setting. Ultimately, what you're trying to do most of the time, at least for our class, is to try to achieve neutral color. And obviously we don't have neutral color in all of these things. So again, I'm asking you to kind of break the rules so we can see that color cast that occurs at the different combinations of available light and tungsten. So for instance, this image has too much of a blue color cast because the tungsten white balance setting is trying to compensate for the yellowness of tungsten light. So the camera adds blue to it. Well, daylight is already kind of neutral or bluish, so if you add more blue to it, it looks too blue. Auto white balance does a good job in a lot of scenes. And in fact, later on, that'll probably just be my recommendation, is to just go with auto, particularly when we're shooting with RAW as a format. But it doesn't always work well in all cases. And, you know, again, you have white balance settings that are matched to different kinds of light. So one of the things that you could look at when you're looking through your images is, well, what looks more neutral? The auto white balance setting or the sun white balance setting? And they're pretty close. I don't see a huge difference between them. So I think in that case, they both worked well. And in order to see color casts, you want to look at things like grays in your scene, whites in your scene, light skin tone. So not all scenes will have those kinds of things in them, so you might just kind of have to compare. And a lot of times you have to train your brain to see color and color cast. And so a lot of times the easiest way to do that is to have different versions of the scene with different white balances. You know, if you saw this one in isolation and your brain was not trained that well to determine or detect color cast, you might think that that looks neutral. But when you look at it in combination with these other ones, you can say, oh, well, no, those are better. Those have better color separation, meaning the things that should be pink are pink, the things that should be green are green, the things that should be brownish orange are brownish orange. But if we look at it here, it's like we're looking through a bluish filter. So everything has a bluish color cast. So again, this is not about achieving the right white balance for the scene, I should say. It's just seeing what happens when we change white balance and how that affects the color cast, or how the color temperature of light may be more obvious when we're changing those white balance settings. So here, you know, we're on the cloudy setting. So if we look over here at the metadata, we can see there's a cloud icon. The tungsten looks like the old-fashioned light bulb in a lot of cameras. And this is technically a manual icon. Usually that's what that means, but in this case it's the fluorescent. Now I know with the Canon cameras, for whatever reason, at least this is how it used to be, the only icon that would show up here would be auto white balance, and then I think the rest of them would have just the little person. This, you can see here, is a Nikon camera. So Nikon cameras, for whatever reason, usually have the different kind of icons. I want to say maybe the newer Canon cameras do show those different icons. So don't worry about looking for those icons. You probably won't be able to see them in Lightroom or anything. I'm just showing you them as kind of a way to reiterate what's happening. So then we're following along with the chart on the assignment. We're moving to a scene in the shade, shooting it with auto white balance, sun white balance, cloudy white balance, tungsten white balance, and fluorescent white balance. You'll probably have other white balance settings on your camera. Don't use those, just only use these. You might have things like custom, or you might have multiple fluorescents. Skip the custom, skip flash white balances. You only need one fluorescent. All right, so then you would come inside and you would photograph under just whatever kind of light you have at night. That way there's no window light coming in. Go back to the auto white balance, sun, cloudy, tungsten, and then fluorescent. So notice in this case, the most neutral looking one, and we have a lot of whites here, so that really helps us to see the color cast, is this one. And that's on the tungsten setting. And that makes sense because certain kinds of interior light bulbs are tungsten based. They're tungsten light sources. So if we have the tungsten white balance, that should match our light source and give us neutral color with good color separation. If we jump over here to the auto white balance, we can see this has almost kind of a pink color cast. So in this case, auto didn't really do a good job, and that's pretty typical. It usually doesn't work very well on tungsten light for whatever reason. And so that is much more neutral. Then you're still going to work inside, but you want to do it during the day so that you have one or more lights on inside, also with daylight coming in. That's mixed lighting, so we've got light with two different color temperatures. So again, go back to the auto setting on your white balance, sun white balance, cloudy white balance, tungsten white balance, and fluorescent. Now, again, the thing that auto looks pretty neutral actually. We've got a lot of whites in here. These are kind of warmer. That's a little cooler, pretty neutral, and that's definitely warm. So if we go between these two, they're both fairly neutral, but that's a little cooler. That one's probably the best. I think that's got the best color separation. So, you know, when you're looking at color temperature and kind of trying to train your brain to detect color casts and looking for best color separation, you know, the first question you can ask yourself is, okay, does it seem neutral or too warm or too cool? You know, I wouldn't try to really get into the nitty-gritty of it. Well, is it too blue? Is it too yellow? Is it too red? I think if you start off with those more basic questions, that can help you ultimately when we come into Lightroom and start correcting color. Now, it also will be helpful to just kind of go in there and move sliders around, because sometimes you can't really see things until you make a change, like I said before. Okay, and then finally, we're inside still, and we're working with fluorescent light. So, you know, if you have a compact fluorescent bulb, you can use that, or if you're in some other kind of space where they have those long tubular lights, those are fluorescents as well. So auto white balance, sun, cloudy, the fluorescent white balance setting, or I'm sorry, tungsten, and then fluorescent. And so this is interesting, and this is pretty common. The fluorescent white balance setting really doesn't look that neutral. It looks kind of reddish to me. Here's auto white balance on fluorescent. So I find on a lot of cameras that auto white balance actually does a better job of delivering neutral color balance than fluorescent. And that could be because there's a lot of different kinds of fluorescent bulbs with different color temperatures. So, you know, a particular fluorescent setting on a camera may actually be calibrated to a different color temperature than that particular fluorescent light bulb. So it's very common to see auto working better. So that gives you some example images of what kinds of things you would be making for this assignment. Again, it's just kind of exploring. We're not really dealing with creating masterpiece images. We're just experimenting and practicing with a new set of ideas and tools. So like always, I would start on the assignment sooner rather than later. That way, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me and I can keep you on track.